Julie, my wife Julie, is a firstborn child, and she grew up with her mom and her younger sister. Well, being a older sister, firstborn, in a home with a single parent, she became very overprotective. Very overprotective of her little sister. In fact, her little sister's first word was, "Don't." So the thing is Julie didn't leave that overprotectiveness behind. She kind of brought some of that overprotectiveness into our marriage and applied it to me and to the kids. But I remember one time when, right after we were married, shortly after we were married, we lived in Kansas City. And then we were in downtown Kansas City. And in Kansas City, there's a river that runs through downtown. And they had just made it really nice. So they had a little walk along the river, sidewalk and everything. And they had some handrails around to keep you from falling into the river. Well, being young and, well, having fun, I decided I was going to climb up on the curb along the edge and hold onto the pole, on the riverside of the pole, that is, or the handrail. Julie didn't like that. And her overprotective nature kicked in, and she started saying, "Get over here now." In fact, I had to because she was about to cry. But the thing is I was a little offended by that. Because I looked at it and I'm like, she didn't understand how strong I am. She underestimated my strength. She underestimated my coordination. She underestimated my ability to hang on to that rail and not fall into the water. The thing is, she was probably right. Yeah. It was probably not safe. I know it wasn't. I'm just saying probably to save face a little here. It was probably not a smart thing to do. I probably shouldn't have done it. But I could. I was able. You see, she didn't recognize my greatness. Of course, I say all this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I say it to make a point, a greater point about someone who is far greater than I am. And I'm talking about Jesus today. And you notice the title of my message is Jesus is Awesome. And I gave it that title at the risk of sounding cheesy, but I gave it that title because it's true. Jesus is awesome. And I'm not just talking about our pop culture awesome. I mean, I used to think I was awesome. I would have said, I'm sure I've said Dr. Pepper is awesome, Camaros are awesome, basketball is awesome, chocolate is awesome. But you know what? They're not. They've never really caused me to sit in awe. But Jesus is awesome. Do we know that? Do we know the difference between Jesus being awesome and Dr. Pepper being awesome? Do we truly understand that Jesus is awesome? Do we think about that? When we pray, do we recognize that? Do we think about that? When we sing our praises, do we think about that? Do we recognize this? When we talk about Jesus, does it sound like he's awesome? Well, in the book of Mark, in the passage that we're going to look at today and also the passage that we're going to look at next week, Mark is telling us about this. In fact, he records several incidences in Jesus' life that show us his complete power and authority. The complete power and authority of Jesus. And he starts in the passage we're looking at today by showing us that Jesus is greater than nature. So we start in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. He says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. So we're picking up the story where we left it off last week. And if you remember, Jesus had been teaching from the boat. The crowds were all there along the shore. He was sitting in the boat, pushed offshore just a little ways so he can talk to them and teach everyone without being crowded in and overcome by the crowd. And so he's there in the boat, but now he decides for him and his disciples to go across the lake. Now, we're not told why they wanted to go across the lake or why Jesus wanted to go across the lake, but I'm guessing there's a couple possibilities. One is that he could be just tired. He's been teaching all day, and he's been with the people all day, and now he just needs some time to get away. And which kind of makes sense too, because as we'll see in the story, as soon as he gets in the boat, he falls asleep. The other possibility is that he could be saying, let's go over there so that I can teach in other cities, because that's what he's been about doing, going from place to place and teaching in different cities. But we're told that they took him just as he was and started heading across the lake. So we get the impression that Jesus has been there, he's been teaching most of the day, and he finally finishes up, turns to the disciples and says, hey, let's go across the lake. And they say, okay, and they go. So he doesn't get out of the boat or anything, just head across to the other side of the lake. Now, before we go on and read the rest of the story, I want to tell you a couple details that might be helpful in understanding what happens. First of all, several of the disciples were fishermen, which meant that they worked on the lake. And they probably spent most of their time not too far from shore, fishing, but they knew the lake. They knew that lake. We're talking about the Sea of Galilee here. So they knew that lake, and they knew how to handle a boat. Second thing, the lake that they're on, the Sea of Galilee, was surrounded by mountains. And these mountains had narrow valleys that run through them. They still do. It's a real place. But it's surrounded by mountains that have narrow valleys that run through them. And those narrow valleys can act like wind tunnels. And a slight change in weather could bring up wind. And it would rush through those tunnels. The thing is, we understand about a slight change in the weather bringing up wind because we live here near the coast. And we understand that wind can just come up at any time. In fact, you also know if you go about 5 miles inland, not as much wind. You come here to the coast, it's windy. Sometimes I'm here in the morning, no wind. Next thing you know, it's really windy. It just happens. Well, this would happen over there as well. But that wind would come up and that wind would rush down the mountainside and rush through those valleys, and it would cause storms on this lake. So the wind, as it blew across, would make the water choppy and could, if it blew enough, would make waves on this lake. And it was dangerous. But it was a very common thing that could happen, and it could be very dangerous. The wind, the choppy water, even waves. So let's keep reading there here in verse 37. It says, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. So this is a huge storm. We're talking about great power here because it says it's a great windstorm. So the wind is blowing hard and it's causing problems there on the lake. And it also appears to have come up quickly and is quickly filling the boat because it says the waves were already filling the boat. And so it's come and it's sudden and it's upon them and it's filling the boat and the disciples are in danger. So what's Jesus going to do about it? Look at verse 38. But he was in the stern asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? So here they are, they're in this storm and Jesus is sleeping. Now some of us may, why is he sleeping? Some of us could be, how could he be sleeping? I imagine if the water is filling the boat that he's getting wet and he's just sleeping. Well, on one hand, he's probably very tired. But on another hand, I think he's just not scared. He's not worried about anything. You know why? Because he's better or stronger than any wind. He's stronger than any storm. So he's not worried about it. And he's just sleeping. But you can hear the indignation in the voices of the disciples. Teacher, don't you care that we're dying? And looks like they really fear that they're going to drown and die on that water. Don't you care? They're truly scared. But why are they in such a panic? I mean, Jesus is there, right? Well, apparently they don't realize the greatness of Jesus. They've seen him perform miracles. They've seen what he's done. But they haven't applied it to this situation. And some reason, they don't recognize just how great and powerful he is. Now, the ironic thing is this, they call him teacher. But they haven't caught what he's been teaching. And I don't believe here they were asking for a miracle. I think they were simply asking Jesus to wake up and help. Why aren't you pulling your weight? Why aren't you helping? Why aren't you doing your part? And the reason I say this is because we're going to see their reaction when Jesus actually does perform a miracle. They weren't expecting it. But they say, Jesus, teacher, don't you care that? In other words, get up and help. So let's see what Jesus does. And I love this because it seems so nonchalant. Verse 39. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased. And there was a great calm. Jesus wakes up and it's like no big deal. He simply sits up and says, stop it. And it stops. It was no big thing. And this great storm, same word, great storm, turns into a great calm. We went from chaos to total peace. But then he turns to the disciples. Look what he says to them. Verse 40. And he said to them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Why are you so afraid? Which implies you shouldn't be. But that's, yes, why are you so afraid? And the word for afraid he uses here is a negative word for afraid. It suggests something like shame, like they're being cowardly. Why are you being such cowards? He says to them. He says, don't you still don't yet have faith? Which implies they should have that faith by now. They should understand who Jesus is, or recognize that he has power and authority, but they don't. But the reprimand doesn't seem to bother them because they're too busy being amazed at what had just happened. Look at verse 41. It says, and they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? They're filled with great fear. And this word here refers to their reverential fear, a deep respect for Jesus. They are in awe of Jesus. They're just standing there amazed and can't believe what they just saw. Jesus is awe-inspiring because Jesus is awesome. So they just stand there and sit there wondering in amazement and awe, who then is this? See, because what they just saw makes no sense to them at all. Because they know Jesus, and they know he's a man, and they know he performs miracles. But at the same time, who is it that controls the winds and the seas, the wind and the waves? It's God. And they know this. In fact, we can read in Psalm 89, verses 8 and 9, it says this, O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you? You rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Sure sounds a whole lot like what Jesus just did. We can also look in the book of Job. And in Job 38, God is talking to Job. This is after he's gone through his whole situation, and he's kind of coming to some resolution. And God says to Job, where were you when I created? In other words, God is saying, hey, I'm God and you're a man. What are you doing complaining? But he's confronting Job about this. And he's saying, look, I'm the one who created everything, not you. I'm God, not you. And he's talking about when he created the oceans. And he says this in verses 10 and 11 of Job 38. He says that God did this and prescribed limits for it, talking about the sea, and set bars and doors and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. He's saying the reason why the ocean doesn't come further up on the shores is because God said, you stop right there. So he created the oceans and he created the dry land. And he says the waves, you can crash on the shore, but you're not going past this point. Now we can scientifically say, well, it's because of the moon and the tide and the sun, but you know what? Who created the moon and the tide? God. And God tells it, you stop right there. God is the one who controls the wind and the sea. And the disciples are looking at these things. And they say, these things, the wind and sea, obey Jesus. He got up and said, stop it, and they did. They obeyed him. So who is Jesus? I'll let you answer. Who is Jesus? He's God. But the disciples are there and they see this and they are in awe of him. And I want to ask you a question this morning. When was the last time you were struck by the awesomeness of Jesus? When is the last time you just sat in wonder thinking about Jesus and how great he is, how awesome he is? You see, I think we get too used to him sometimes. We've gotten so comfortable just thinking because, we read the Bible and we read the stories and we see these things that he's done and we're like, yep, that's great. We should marvel at these things. I mean, these things are awesome. So when's the last time we did that? I don't know, but we're going to stop and do it right now. I don't do this very often, but I'm going to let you respond to me here, okay? Tell me, what is so awesome about Jesus? Go ahead and call it out. Tell me something awesome about Jesus. I heard grace. I heard he saved us from sin. I heard save the world. He died for us. What? Provision. What else?
For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth and under the earth.
That's right. He's the creator. And someone else said something here. He loves us all. Comforter. Our Redeemer. These are awesome things about Jesus. I made a list. Let me read my list. I just started it because, it's not in any way conclusive. Complete. Thank you. But let me think this. He has always existed. He wasn't created. He has always been. He is fully God and fully man. Catch this one. He has never sinned. We just said he was fully man. But he has never sinned. Now that is amazing. He's never done anything opposed to God's will. Catch this one. As a man, I find this amazing. As a human, I find this amazing. He has never been selfish. Think about that. Who in here has never been selfish? If anyone raises your hand, we have all been selfish. Jesus has never been selfish. He knows everything about me. That alone is amazing. But add to this, he knows everything about me and he still loves me. He is full of grace and truth. John 1 tells us that. Now think about that. There's a lot of people who are full of truth and don't have much grace. There are a lot of people who are all about grace but don't really care much about the truth. Jesus is full of grace and truth. He has all power and all authority. And he willingly allowed people to put him to death. He did it to pay for our sin, to pay a debt he didn't owe. But then what did he do? He rose from the dead and he is alive. Here's something else amazing. He will return. He is coming back, and he will rule over this earth, and he will rule for eternity. Jesus is compassionate, he is kind, he is gracious, and yet he is bold and stands for truth and for the honor of God. Jesus promises to always be with us, and he never breaks his promises. Now, I'm sure we could keep going, and maybe this is a good practice for us. Let's think about the awesome things that Jesus is. So let me ask one more question. Who is the greatest of all time? Do you believe that? Who is the greatest of all time? Jesus. I'm still not convinced. Who is the greatest of all time? Jesus. That's right. All right. I'm not just trying to be a cheerleader here, but I am a little bit. See, we need to recognize these things. We need to remember these things about Jesus. We need to think about it. We need to remember it. We need to be awe-inspired by Jesus because Jesus is truly awesome. And we need to declare it. Don't be afraid to say it. Jesus is truly awesome. Well, Mark continues now to show us the greatness of Jesus. And now what we see is that Jesus is greater than the supernatural. Look at chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. It says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So after Jesus has changed this great storm into a great calm, they finish their journey across the across the lake, and they come to a Gentile area on the east side of the lake. And when he gets there, he's met by a demon-possessed man on the shore. Now, Mark has described this man for us. His condition is very well known by the people around him, and his condition is not good. He hangs out by tombs. He is constantly crying out in anguish, and he hurts himself. This is someone we would say is out of his mind, because normal people don't do these things. Normal people don't hang out in graveyards, for one. I mean, all the time. You'll visit them, but you don't just hang out with them. So normal people don't do these things. But the thing is, his friends and his family, the people around him, they can't do anything to stop him from doing it. They can't do anything to help him. They have tried, but they're just not strong enough. It says that they tried to subdue him, and this word is also used for like taming a wild animal. So they have tried to get him under control. They have tried to make him civilized, but they haven't been able to. It says that they bound him, they tied him up, but every time they would tie him up, he would get away. They even used chains, and we're told that even the chains couldn't hold him because he tore them apart. Now think about this for a minute. This is amazing. Metal is hard. Metal is hard to break. Metal is hard to tear. A few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, Michael had a noise in his car. His car started making this funny noise. Well, we crawled under the car, and what we found out is there was a problem with his drive shaft. And his drive shaft had a bracket on it, and that bracket had been torn. I mean, this is metal that's about 1/16 of an inch thick, little tabs, had torn off. And I would look at that, and I was amazed. Because I'm like, think of how much torque it would take to just rip metal. And I'm thinking, this is amazing. Even with an engine connected to it, that's amazing. And then I read this passage. And here is a man who is breaking chains and tearing shackles apart. This man is strong. And That's the point that Mark is telling us. He has superhuman strength, supernatural strength. And no one is able to overcome his strength. But I'll let you in on the end of the story. Jesus will. So now we get the details here. In verses 6, look at verses 6 to 9. He said, when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me. For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. So Jesus comes to the shore, and it looks like this man recognizes him, Jesus, from afar off, and runs out of the graveyard to the shore to see Jesus. Now, why does this man run to Jesus? Well, it's not clear, but either this man himself is drawn to Jesus and came for help, or the demon is drawn against his will to Jesus by his authoritative presence. But for however it happened, whatever reason he came, he ran to Jesus and bows down in front of him. And when he bows down in front of Jesus, this isn't an act of worship. This is an act of submission. Because what's going on here is there is a supernatural conflict here. And Jesus is clearly the superior. You see, the demon, he knows who Jesus is. In fact, he says it. He says, what are you doing here, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? He knew who Jesus was. And he's afraid of him. He knew Jesus had power and authority over him. And so he comes and bows. But when he bows, he also complains. What are you doing here? Leave me alone. You see, he's threatened by the presence of Jesus, which totally makes sense. But catch this. This demon, who was just described as giving this man superhuman strength, is now cowering at the feet of Jesus. And he says to Jesus, I adjure you, or I implore you, by God, do not torment me. The demon here is calling on the only authority there is above Jesus. He's calling on the authority of God the Father. But why? Well, Matthew helps us understand this point. In Matthew 8:29, he tells us that the demon says, do not torment me before the time. And so he's probably talking about that there is a time when Satan and his demons, his angels, will be judged. But he's saying, it's not time yet. Leave me alone. You've come prematurely. And he's appealing God to stop Jesus from doing anything that he shouldn't do. Or anything that Jesus doesn't have the authority to do. But you'll notice that his appeal to Jesus or appeal to God doesn't do any good, because Jesus is God and Jesus does the will of God, and he will do what he's able to do. And he tells the demon, get out. But as he tells him to get out, he asks him his name. Now, why does he ask? This is a strange thing. Why would he ask the name? Well, some people have suggested, well, because he's trying to gain authority or power over the demon, because that's what some exorcists will do. People who do exorcism will do that. Ask the name. You know what? That's not what Jesus is doing. You know why I know? Because Jesus already has power and authority over this demon. We've seen it already. He's told him to get out. He's asking the name. I think it might be to let the disciples in and to let us in on just how desperate of a situation this man was in. To show us the power and the chaos that this man was under. Because the demon answers. And he says, our name is Legion, for we are many. He was possessed not by one demon, but by many. In fact, the Roman legions were made up of about 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers. And so what the demon is saying is that we're an army. There is an army of demons that have taken up residence in this man and have tormented this man. But they have also given him incredible strength. But even in such great numbers, they are no match for Jesus. Continue reading verse 10 through 14. It says, "And he begged him earnestly, 'Do not send us out of the country.' And now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, 'Send us to the pigs, let us enter them.' So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it to the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened." So these demons are powerless before Jesus and beg him to let them stay in the area, in order to not banish them. And again, Luke helps us to understand what they're asking here. The idea, because he adds the idea of being sent into the abyss. Don't send us into the abyss. So they're begging not to be confined, not to be restricted, not to be imprisoned, not to suffer their ultimate destiny yet. And so they ask, can we be sent into this herd of pigs? Well, we know it's not a Jewish area, right? Because there's a herd of pigs there. So they ask, can we be sent into this herd of pigs? And Jesus lets them. The pigs all go crazy and they rush down into the water and drown themselves. The pig herd, I think the reason why Jesus let him, because we might be asked, why did Jesus let him go into pigs? I think the reason why is, again, maybe to show us the destructive nature of demons and the chaos that this man had been suffering under. But the pig herders, they see it and they run into town and around the country and they tell everyone what had happened. Now they do it probably on one hand because they're a little scared. They probably also are running around saying, we're responsible for these pigs that are now dead. Let's go tell everyone, hey, it's not our fault. And so they run in and tell everyone about it. And look what happens, verse 15. It says, "And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region." So they come and they find everything just as it was described. Jesus is there, and they see the man who has obviously gone through a huge change. He is calm, he's clothed, he's not crazy. And it scares them. They are in awe of what they've seen, but they're also just plain afraid. You see, they recognize that there has been supernatural power displayed here. But they want nothing to do with it. And maybe it's because they knew the strength of that demon-possessed man. I mean, they had dealt with him firsthand. They had tried to bind him, and they were not able to. They knew how strong he was. And now someone who's even stronger is in town. And they look at Jesus and they ask him to leave. They don't understand who he is, and they don't care to. They're not really interested. And they ask him to leave. You see, I think they're afraid of what having Jesus around might do to their lives. Maybe they fear more loss. Maybe they fear he might bring hardships. But they are turned off by Jesus rather than attracted to him. You see, their reaction is the opposite of a faith response. But look at the man's response, the formerly possessed man, in verse 18 through 20. It says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began proclaiming in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. You see, this man wants to stay with Jesus. Jesus has delivered him. He has freed him, and he wants to stay with Jesus. You'll notice that the people came and they begged Jesus to leave. This man comes and he begs Jesus to let him follow. Now, Jesus says no, but he's not saying you can't follow me like you can't believe me. But he says, don't come with me. You need to stay here. And he sends this man home. He leaves him as a witness to all that Jesus has done. He leaves that man as a witness. He says, go home to your friends and family. Now, he hasn't been home for a while. He's been hanging around the graveyard. And his friends and his family, when they see him, they will recognize the difference. And they will know something amazing has happened to him. And Jesus says, go home and tell them what has happened. You go home and tell them about me. And so he went all over that Gentile area. The Decapolis means 10 cities. So all over that area, telling people about Jesus, who had freed him from bondage, who had freed him from the power of those demons. Now here's the thing. You and I, if we have believed in Jesus as our Savior, we have been freed from bondage as well. And we have been sent as witnesses to go and to tell everyone what Jesus has done for us. And when we think about Jesus and what he's done for us and how awesome he is and how awesome it is what he has done for us, I think it ought to boil over inside of us. In fact, we might not be able to contain it. We will want to tell. And I think if you don't just have that desire to tell others what Jesus has done for you, I would suggest you need to spend some time thinking about the awesomeness of Jesus. You need to spend some time thinking about how awesome it is that you have been delivered, that you have been set free from the bondage of sin, that you were on your way to hell, but you are no longer, that you were cut off from God, but you are no longer. This is an awesome thing. This is an amazing thing. And we need to sit in wonder and in awe of Jesus. And we need to remember those things and think about those things. And you may be here and you may be thinking, well, I just don't have a great testimony. And I would say I disagree. Because it doesn't matter what your story is. If you have believed in Jesus and have been saved, you have a great testimony. Because you have been delivered from bondage. So whether you grew up in church and you were saved at a very young age like I was, or if you are someone who was basically a good person, but at one point realized, I'm not that good, I have a sin problem, and you came to Jesus and you were rescued and saved by Jesus, or if you were someone who was deep into sinful things and Jesus reached in and pulled you out of that, every single one of us has an amazing testimony because we have all been delivered by him, by our awesome Savior. We have all been delivered out of darkness and been given new life. And I would say this about myself. I was a self-absorbed, sin-soaked enemy of God, and I was only 4. But I was a self-absorbed, sin-soaked enemy of God on my way to hell. But Jesus changed that. That is awesome. That is something to marvel about. Now, there are a lot of things that we can really like, that we can be very passionate about. There are a lot of things that we could even stand and cheer and shout about. But of all these things that we make a big deal of, Jesus is truly the biggest deal. There is no other Savior. There is no one or no thing greater or stronger than he is. Jesus is awesome. Don't forget it and make a big deal about it. Jesus is awesome.